After my father passed away, I spent 10 difficult childhood years believing my family was poor. But the truth is, there was a large sum of money, and it was enough to change my life completely. My mother hid it from me and used it for something else. What would you do if you were me after discovering the truth? Let me tell you the story. This is about my mother's betrayal, a truth that tore my family apart and changed my life forever. Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Miller. I'm 26 years old, living alone in a small apartment in the heart of Chicago. Each day of my life revolves around my job as a programmer at a game development company. It might seem like a regular job to most people, but to me, it's a lifelong passion that started in my childhood. I used to believe that as long as I stayed committed to this path, I could build a future that truly belonged to me. But now, looking at where I am, I realize how simple my life has become. So simple that it feels empty. I go to work, come home, and repeat the same dull routine. There's no one left to talk to or share anything with. Maybe that's the price I've had to pay for the events that left lasting marks on my life. My story began 2 years ago when I was still living in a small house on the outskirts of Chicago. That house was where I lived with my mother, Linda, the most critical person in my life. After my father passed away when I was just 13, she became my only source of strength. Every night in that house, I would see the soft yellow light glowing through the window like a quiet sign of peace for my weary heart. I gave my mother all my love and gratitude for years because I believed she had carried the burden of raising me alone. I thought it fully, and I never allowed myself to doubt her. But the truth always finds a way to reveal itself, no matter how hard we try to deny it or avoid it. And then, on what seemed like just another ordinary day, the secret my mother had hidden for so many years was finally exposed. It was a secret powerful enough to erase all the trust one had placed in her and to destroy the image of the mother I had once admired. From that moment on, I knew my life would never return to how it used to be. It was an early weekday in late autumn, just after I had turned 24. The crisp air of Chicago still clung to the fading yellow leaves, and I had no idea that what seemed like an ordinary afternoon would mark the beginning of irreversible changes. Changes triggered by the appearance of a stranger inside my own home. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I returned to the house to grab a few things I had forgotten. But the moment I stepped into the living room, I froze. Sitting calmly on the sofa across from me was a woman I had never seen before. She looked composed, almost too composed. On the other hand, my mother whipped her head around to look at me, her eyes flashing with a hint of panic. At first, I assumed the woman was just an old friend of my mom's, but the way she studied me and her gaze instantly stirred something uneasy in my chest. And then, my mother's next move shattered any hope that this was just a harmless visit. As I stepped into the room, I expected my mother to smile and introduce us just like always whenever someone came over, but that didn't happen. Instead, she jumped up, her face visibly shaken. After a few seconds of tense silence, my mother suddenly snapped, "Get out of here! Don't come back!" Her words hit the room like a thunderclap, filling the air with a heavy tension. I stood frozen, completely lost, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear through my chest. What shook me even more was the woman's reaction. She didn't panic. She didn't even try to leave in a hurry. In fact, there was a strange calmness in her eyes, a quiet confidence that sent chills down my spine. It felt as if she had been expecting this moment all along. After a glance that carried a hint of discomfort, my mother suddenly turned to me and asked, "Laura, why are you home at this hour?" That seemingly harmless question made me realize she was trying to brush away the heavy tension that had filled the room. I gave a short reply, saying I had just stopped by to grab my laptop and would leave immediately. As I finished speaking, I shifted slightly, about to walk toward my small bedroom. But just then, the woman across from my mother turned and looked directly at me. There was something severe in her eyes, and then, in a calm and steady voice, she asked, "Are you Laura?" I froze on the spot. That question hit me like a jolt, leaving me speechless. Instinctively, I stared at her and quickly asked, How do you know my name?" Before I could finish processing what was happening, my mother's voice suddenly rang out loud and sharp. "Don't you dare say another word in front of my daughter." Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. I stood motionless in the middle of the living room, stunned. My heart was pounding nonstop in the thick, suffocating air, filled with unanswered questions. Not because of the strange woman, but because of my mother's reaction. It was so out of character, so frantic. I had never seen her like that in all my years growing up. The presence of that woman wasn't something my mother, I, or anyone else in this house had expected. Before I could pull myself together, the woman suddenly started walking toward me. My mother tried to stop her, stumbling in confusion, but the woman pressed on, asking a series of sharp, direct questions in a tone that sounded like an investigator. She mentioned benefits, insurance money, and even a father who passed away years ago. Hearing words I didn't understand, my mind spiraled into chaos. I stammered in confusion and asked desperately, "What? What are you talking about? Why are you bringing up my father? What money? What money are you talking about?" As soon as the questions left my mouth, my mother lunged forward, trying to pull the woman away. Her hands were trembling, her movements clumsy, as if she were trying to cover the woman's mouth at any cost. I looked at her eyes and saw pure panic. All the calm and control she usually carried was gone, but that panic only seemed to make the woman more resolute. She stepped slightly back, lifted her head, and with a voice that rang clearly in the room, she asked my mother, "Did you steal the military insurance money and the $500 monthly trust that Richard left for Laura?" Hearing that, I felt like everything inside me collapsed. My ears started ringing, my chest tightened, my body froze. The only thing I could feel was an overwhelming sense of shock. My mother looked like she had just come face to face with her deepest fear. She muttered a few meaningless words, then suddenly screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "She's lying, Laura. Don't believe her. I'll sue you for slander." Her voice sliced through the silence of the room. And there I was, standing between two opposing forces. On one side, a stranger whose eyes showed nothing but certainty. On the other hand, my mother was the person I had trusted my whole life. I stood there frozen, my thoughts scattered. It felt like the house I had known so well had turned into a dark maze, and I was utterly lost in what I used to call home. The air felt so thick in that small living room that it was hard to breathe. The woman's accusations echoed in my ears. My heart was racing out of control, and my mind was confused. Suddenly, my mother's scream shattered the tension. "Get out of my house before I call the police. You're nothing but a scammer." Her sharp voice jolted me, like she was trying to throw up a wall to hide something. Right after yelling, she turned to me, rambling with frantic explanations. She said the woman was making up stories to extort money, that she was trying to tear our family apart, that it was all just a performance. But my mother's words didn't shake the woman at all. Instead, she calmly stood up, walked to the sofa, and picked up her purse. Before leaving, she turned back to face my mother. Her gaze was steady, cold even, and her voice came out firm and clear. "You should tell your daughter the truth before she finds it out alone." It felt like something inside my mother was about to explode at that moment. Her face turned bright red, her eyes filled with a fury I had never seen, and there I was, caught in the middle of two clashing emotions. Each word, each look between them, cut into me like a blade, leaving behind the first cracks in the trust one had held for so many years. But what the woman said right before she left broke something inside me. As she walked past me, my feet felt stuck to the floor. In that brief pause, she leaned slightly toward me and in a low voice filled with quiet intent said, "If you want to know the truth, call me." Then she placed a business card in my hand. I didn't even have time to grip it before my mother lunged forward. Her hand was trembling but aggressive, yanking the card from my fingers. She squeezed it so hard the edges tore and small bits of paper scattered onto the floor. That moment left me speechless. I couldn't understand why she reacted so violently, but deep down a feeling of doubt had already begun to take root. Amid all that chaos, the woman remained calm in a way that almost felt unreal. She slowly made her way to the door, composed as if she had experienced this kind of confrontation before. And just as she was about to leave the house, she stopped. She turned around. Her eyes were sharp, as if cutting right through both of us. Her voice rang out, every word hitting with undeniable weight. "My name is Sarah Collins. I was a close friend of Richard, your father. I'm an attorney at Collins and Parker Law Firm in Milwaukee." Instantly, my mother lunged forward and pressed herself close to my ear, screaming in desperation. "Don't believe her, Laura. She's a liar. She's trying to blackmail me." And I stood there like a stone, frozen by the fury of the woman who had always been calm and gentle for over 20 years. My eyes followed the back of the stranger as she disappeared through the doorway. For a brief moment, my head spun and my chest tightened. I no longer knew what was true and what was a lie. I only knew one thing for sure. From the moment Sarah stepped out of that house, my life would never return to how it used to be. As soon as the woman who claimed to be a lawyer disappeared behind the small front door, our house returned to its usual quiet. But that calm was nothing more than a fragile shell. Beneath it, the air still felt heavy, like the aftermath of a storm that had passed but left tremors behind. My mother sat there with her hands tightly clasped, her eyes red and swollen. The panic in her gaze made my chest tighten with a suffocating weight. Before I could even say a word, she rushed to explain. She said the woman had once borrowed money from my father and disappeared. After he passed away and we had to move, she said she never managed to find the woman again. Then her voice began to waver. She said the woman had been secretly in love with my dad. That jealousy had consumed her, and now she was back to destroy what was left of our family. Her words kept coming one after another, weaving into a messy tangle of stories. The more I listened, the more confused I became. Everything sounded vague, scattered, and somehow off. Before I could sort through any of it, my mother held my cold hands. Her eyes were full of desperation, her voice trembling as she pleaded, "Laura, don't let that woman fool you. She nearly broke up our family once. You believe me, don't you?" Then tears rolled down her cheeks. She wrapped her arms tightly around me, crying and calling out my father's name between sobs, blaming him for leaving us behind. "Why did you leave me and Laura all alone? And now she's back to ruin everything because she couldn't have you." As I watched my mother collapse into my shoulder, my heart softened. That question, "Do you believe me?" took me back to when I was 13, the day my father died. I remembered her fighting alone to raise me. I had no reason not to believe the woman who gave up everything for me. I hugged her back, whispering as if to calm us both. In that moment, I had only one wish, that everything she told me was true. I just wanted to believe. I needed to hold on to that. But later, when I packed up my old laptop and returned to the office, the events from less than an hour earlier kept replaying. Every look, every word, every detail played on loop, like a scene from a film I couldn't turn off. A strange feeling began to stir inside me, something I couldn't quite name. It was subtle, but undeniable. Some details, small, seemingly unimportant ones, lined up with old memories in a way that was just too perfect to ignore. On the way back to the office, my mind spun like it was trapped inside an endless loop. Every word Sarah had said echoed in my ears. Her calm, almost unnervingly steady eyes stayed vivid in my memory. It wasn't the gaze of someone caught in a dispute. It felt like she was a judge with the evidence in her hands. And then the phrases $500 a month and insurance rang in my head, pulling up a vague memory from when I was 15. That memory came rushing back like a warning I had ignored for far too long. Back then, just 2 years after my father died, my mother and I moved out of our old house and into a new place. We hadn't lived there long, but it had been tied to some of the hardest days of my childhood. After Dad passed from a sudden heart attack, my mother carried the weight of everything on her own. Those 2 years were a struggle. There were days we had to cut meals. I didn't have proper clothes like the other kids, but being with her was the only thing that helped me hold on. And yet, as we got closer to the move, I noticed strange things. My mother was out more often, always returning with a hurried expression. It wasn't the frantic panic I saw in her today, but it still made me uneasy. Sometimes I'd wake up to whispered late-night phone calls. Her voice was low, and there were long, uncomfortable silences in between. Then, just a few weeks later, she abruptly announced that we were moving. She said it simply, "I found a better place." I still remember wondering how we could afford to move when we barely made ends meet. On moving day, while she stepped out to take a call on the landline in the living room, I ended up cleaning a cabinet she always kept locked. The door had been left slightly open, and among the half-packed belongings, I found a notebook. I remember it clearly, a hardcover journal with worn corners from age. Inside were numbers that stopped me cold. $500. The exact amount is repeated month after month. Between the pages was a slip of paper, a receipt or payment notice from some administrative office. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Before I could read further, my mother walked in. Her eyes were sharp, colder than I had ever seen. She rushed toward me and snatched the notebook from my hands. Her voice was tight and sharp when she spoke. "Don't ever touch my things again. I was just a kid back then. Still growing up, I didn't think too hard about it. I didn't ask questions. And eventually, I forgot. But now, every scattered piece of memory was falling into place with terrifying clarity. A strange fear began crawling through me. Not just fear in the usual sense, but the kind that feels like an invisible hand is pressing down on your chest, squeezing until it's hard to breathe. I tried to calm myself, but I told myself it was all just a coincidence. But the more I thought about it, the more I sifted through those old memories, the more certain I became. Something wasn't right. There was a truth hiding inside the home I had always believed was the safest place in the world. After those swirling memories that felt chaotic but somehow orchestrated, I tried to return to work as usual, but that autumn afternoon I couldn't focus. That night I stayed late at the office until almost 11 o'clock. When I came home exhausted, I was surprised to see the living room lights still on. Usually my mother would go to bed early. She often said her body was tired and needed to take care of her health, but tonight she was sitting there waiting for me. It was such a rare sight that I stopped at the doorway. As soon as she saw me, she asked with a heavy and unreadable voice, "Where have you been? Why are you home so late?" That question left me speechless. Since I was 16, I had gotten used to working evenings. Later, after I started working full-time, coming home late became normal. Not once had she asked me something like that. And yet tonight, when all the doubts were building up inside me, she acted differently. The shift in her tone left me breathless and confused. Hesitantly, I sat on the familiar sofa where she often chatted with her friends. Looking straight into her eyes, I asked carefully, "Why are you asking me that tonight? Is it because you think I went to see Sarah?" The moment I said Sarah's name, my mother's face froze. She suddenly raised her voice, almost as if trying to silence the unease surrounding us. "You're doubting me now? I've spent my entire life taking care of you." Amidst the tension, I clenched my hands without realizing it, trying to keep calm. Then, with a choked voice, I said, "No, I'm not doubting you. But the way you've been acting lately, it's making it impossible not to ask questions." She went silent. After a few seconds, she turned and walked quickly toward her room, leaving me alone in the living room. As she walked away, her words echoed in my head. "I've spent my entire life taking care of you." And suddenly, I remembered those years after my father died. I remembered how she said we didn't have enough money for a new school uniform and told me she couldn't afford the computer I had always dreamed of, the one I needed to follow my passion. But a few months later, she agreed to vacation with her friends. She came home with new clothes and a brand new handbag. I gave her nearly all my first paycheck when I got older and started working part-time. She said living costs were too high and she couldn't manage independently. I believed her, but not long after, I saw her going to the spa, getting her hair done, and shopping again. When I asked about it, she smiled and said her friends were treating her. She said she needed to relieve stress. Those contradictions kept flooding back, each memory adding to the tangled mess in my head. And for the first time, I had to ask myself a question I had never considered. Where did my mother get the money to do all that while we supposedly lived in hardship? That night, I could hardly sleep. I repeatedly asked myself the same thing in the still, silent dark. What is really happening? What have I missed all these years? The next morning, as the first light of day crept in through the window, I thought I would see a cold and distant version of my mother, someone trying to avoid me. But I was wrong. Before I left for work, she came over to hug me. She gently kissed my forehead and smiled as she said, "Make sure you come home early for dinner with me." All right. After those warm words, she stood at the door and waved goodbye, just like she used to when I was a child. Back then, as soon as I turned the corner at the end of the street, she would already be waiting for me to return. In that moment, something tugged at my heart. I asked myself, am I being too suspicious? But no matter how often I told myself that, the doubt wouldn't go away. It stayed lodged in my mind like a shadow that grew darker as I tried to chase it off. And then I realized sometimes it's the gestures that feel too natural, too perfect in the middle of a situation full of contradictions that make everything even harder to believe. After leaving the house and watching my mother's silhouette disappear behind the closing door, I entered the old familiar car. I planned to drive to the game company in the West Loop, Chicago. From the suburban house where I lived with my mom, it usually took me nearly an hour each morning to get into the city. But that morning, my mind was clouded with the same questions, looping repeatedly. Less than 10 minutes after I left the house and reached the entrance to the Edens Expressway, instead of merging into the lane toward the city, my hand instinctively turned the wheel onto I-94 North. For over an hour and a half on the highway, my head was spinning in a storm of chaotic thoughts. The farther I drove, the more clearly I felt a growing fear. I was afraid that everything I had believed for years was just an illusion, and that my difficult childhood might have been built on a foundation of lies. Whenever a sign for Milwaukee came into view with the mileage shrinking, my chest tightened. I knew I was heading straight toward a truth I might never be ready to hear. At around 8:30 in the morning, I stopped the car in front of a light brick building in the Easttown area. A small sign at the door displayed the name of the law firm that matched what I had looked up the night before when I couldn't sleep. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. As soon as I stood at the reception desk, just a minute later, the woman from yesterday stepped out from the back office. She looked at me with an unbelievably calm expression, then gave a gentle nod. With a faint smile, she slowly said to me, "Since last night, I had a feeling you'd come." After lawyer Sarah said that, my throat went dry. I knew there was no turning back. A few seconds passed. I forced myself to stand straighter and said to her, "I want to know the truth." My words echoed in the quiet room like a turning point. I understood that from this moment on, whatever came next might take away what little family I had left. Sitting across from Sarah in a small office in Milwaukee, I still couldn't understand how she had managed to find my mother and me. Even though so many years had passed since we left the old house, Sarah seemed to sense my curiosity. She looked me in the eyes and slowly began to explain. After my father Richard passed away, the insurance company and the trust fund kept sending disbursement notices to the address of our old house. My mother continued living there for 2 years and received the letters regularly. But when she decided to move, all the envelopes started getting returned with a cold message. Address ceased, no forwarding address. The pile of returned letters raised questions for the trust management office. That was when they asked Sarah for help. She wasn't just a lawyer. She had also been a close friend of my father back when he served in the military. With her skills and access to public records, Sarah followed the trail. A new utility contract, a phone number registration, and even a small loan application under my mother's name. Once put together, each scattered piece led to the suburban house where I had grown up in high school. After the short explanation, Sarah paused momentarily, her eyes fixed on me. Her voice stayed calm, but there was a heavy certainty in it. "Laura, I didn't find you and your mother by accident. It took me years to piece it all together because I knew that money was supposed to be yours." Hearing that, I shuddered. The truth had never gone away. It had quietly followed us, waiting for the day it would reveal itself with enough weight to shake everything I had ever believed in. Just a few seconds later, Sarah quietly pulled open the drawer beside her and took out a thick folder clipped together neatly. She gently slid it toward me and said, "Inside are all the documents your mother secretly kept for over 10 years. When I opened it, each page exposed 2 undeniable truths. The first was the military life insurance. The original file clearly listed me, Laura Miller, as the direct beneficiary. My mother, Linda, was only assigned as the temporary custodian until I turned 21. Yet the entire payout of $400,000 never reached me. The second was the trust fund of $500 a month. Bank statements proved that payments had been made regularly for many years, from when I was 13 until I was 24, adding up to nearly $66,000. Instead of being used for me, all of it had been withdrawn and spent under my mother's signature. Inside the folder, a short note from my father stood out. He had saved part of his military allowance and placed it into the trust, allowing the bank to invest it and create a steady income stream. His only purpose was to ensure I would have at least $500 each month to cover my schooling until I was old enough to care for myself. As I turned each page, my fingers trembled, my eyes blurred, and my heart seemed to break with every number and every cold line. That was the moment when the truth struck like a fatal blow. Through all the hardship, when I had to work extra jobs, skip meals, and lose scholarship opportunities because I could not meet the requirements, I still had a source of money to live on. It had simply never reached me. Around 10 a.m. in the morning, after sitting silently for hours, listening to Sarah recount everything she had worked to uncover and waited for all those years, I left the law office with the heavy folder in my hands. Each step I took on the sidewalk pressed down harder on my chest. A storm of questions rose inside me. Why did my mother do this to me? Was she afraid I would spend the money recklessly? Or had she never trusted me at all? The questions came one after another, suffocating me. That morning, I did not go back to the company. Luckily, I had finished my tasks the night before and could take a day off without much trouble. Only one thought stayed in my head. I had to go home. I had to ask my mother. I had to know the answer. Close to noon, I arrived at the house. When I walked in, my mother sat with her legs propped up on the chair, chatting comfortably on a video call with some old friends. They were the ones who often told me that my mother had worked hard her whole life and that I should try to work even more to help ease her burden. They had once been the excuse behind every reproach I heard, but now all of it cut into me like a knife. When my mother saw me standing at the door with a cold expression, she flinched. Maybe she already knew. But before she could end the call, I stepped straight to the table, threw the folder down, and with a voice choked in anger, I asked her, "Why did you hide this from me?" My sudden question left her frozen. Her hands shook as she opened the folder, each page showing evidence so clear it could not be denied. She did not lie anymore, but she still tried to justify herself. After only a few seconds to regain her composure, in a stiff voice she told me, "I used it for the family. Everything was for you." Her lie made me explode. Memories of my childhood came flooding back in an instant. The days of losing my father, the years of living in hardship, the scholarships I missed only because I did not meet the requirements, and all that time my mother had been spending the money my father had left for me. I shouted, my voice breaking in pain. "For me? I lost my scholarships. I worked 2 shifts a day, while every month you were spending the money Dad left for me." My heart felt crushed with every word I said. My body shook, caught between rage and despair. But what hurt me most was that after everything, my mother still did not say a single word of apology. She kept on trying to defend herself. And in that moment, I knew I could not endure another second. That afternoon, my mother and I stood facing each other in the living room, the place that once held the best memories we shared. On the wall, the photo of me in my high school graduation gown, smiling brightly in her arms, was still hanging in its frame. Yet inside my heart, all those memories shattered along with the weak excuses she clung to. As I turned to leave the old house, my eyes caught the phone still propped up on its stand, the video call still running. The unfinished conversation with her friends had not ended, and maybe they had witnessed the entire confrontation between us. Instead of silence, a voice rang out, sharp and bitter. Judy, the woman who often went to the spa with my mother, suddenly spoke up. "See, I told you already that money was never going to be easy to swallow. You were foolish enough to lend it to your brother for some high-interest scheme, and now it's all gone. How could you possibly hide it from her anymore?" Each word cut into me like a knife, driving deeper into an open wound. I froze. The truth hit me harder than ever. Not only had my mother hidden everything from me, but the money my father left had been lent out for profit. My trust collapsed with every syllable of that cruel revelation. It was still not over. Another woman's voice cut in as soon as Judy stopped talking, shrill and mocking. "Stop pretending. If you weren't so greedy and didn't chase after those high-interest games, there would have been no reason to keep it secret. What you were holding on to all those years wasn't for your daughter." When those words spilled out, my mother trembled as if she wanted to throw herself forward and shut down the cursed call. Her hand reached out, shaking violently, but she could not stop. The iPhone I had worked for months to buy her when I was 22 was hurled straight down onto the tile floor. The screen shattered into pieces. That crashing sound was also the sound of everything I had ever believed in breaking apart. And in that moment, I knew I had lost the mother I once loved more than anything in this world. That afternoon, I left the living room carrying nothing but ruin inside me. The pain I took was not only about the nearly $500,000 my father had left for me, but also about the trust I had given my mother for more than 10 years that had now been betrayed. I had once believed she had struggled and sacrificed everything to raise me because she always complained that my father had died, leaving us with nothing. But in the end, it was all just a cover-up. Just as my hand touched the door, a piercing scream came from behind me. My mother shouted, "You're really going to abandon your own mother like this?" I froze for a few seconds, but realized I could not turn back. My voice came out broken as I asked one final question. "Why can't you tell me the truth even now?" In return, I received nothing but scattered curses, cruel words directed at me and Sarah. No words of kindness, no sign of remorse. Before stepping completely outside, I turned back, my whole body trembling with rage. My throat tightened until it burst out as a scream that ripped through the room. You will pay for what you've done. You will answer to Dad. He would never have allowed you to betray us like this. The sound that tore out of me was more like a roar, carrying the weight of 10 stolen years of youth and the pain of being betrayed by my own mother. After that scream, I turned and walked away, refusing to look back. Behind me, my mother's sobs filled the house that once had been a home. But to me, those sounds no longer felt like comfort. They cut into me like knives, twisting deeper into the wound. When I stepped outside, the wind on the familiar street was bitterly cold, but inside me was a terrifying emptiness. It felt as if part of my soul had died in that house. And in that moment, I understood more clearly than ever. My heart no longer had a place for my mother. After leaving the house, I drove toward the city center. At that moment, I had no idea where I was going, and I had no plan for what I would do next. It was only when my car stopped at the side of an empty park that I realized there was only one thing left for me to do: call Sarah. I told her I could no longer stay silent. In that brief call, Sarah listened, and with the same calm voice I had known, she promised to help me complete all the legal procedures. Right before I hung up, in the freezing air of that silent park, I spoke just one sentence: I have to fight for justice for my father. The lawsuit was filed by Sarah's office the very next day and delivered straight into my mother's hands. From that moment on, the wheel of fate began rolling down a path that could never turn back. While I waited, I did not return home. I stayed at the apartment of a colleague who had once lent me money during those months when my mother claimed she needed cash to fix the house or cover expenses. I had thought I was carrying her burdens, but now I understood it had only been her way of draining me piece by piece. 3 heavy, silent days passed, and then just hours after the papers had been sent from the law office, I received a call from my mother. After 3 days of silence, that ringtone sounded like the signal of a final battle, and I knew I would see it through to the end. On the call, where I still hoped my mother might say something kind, Linda only screamed in rage after receiving the court summons. "You ungrateful child, how dare you sue your own mother?" Hearing those words, I knew there was no room left for compromise. 1 week later, the case was officially filed in the Cook County Court of Illinois, where we lived. From that moment on, I stepped into the spiral of endless days. While I waited, calls from relatives came constantly. Some criticized me for not thinking of family. Others mocked me for greed, and a few sounded sympathetic. But one person remained completely silent. Uncle Marvin, my mother's younger brother, the very man who had taken my father's insurance money from her, then vanished with the promise that he would pay it back with interest. I remembered when he disappeared without a trace. My mother had panicked to the point of madness. When I asked why she was so desperate, she gave me only one short answer: "I'm worried about him." Only now do I understand. She hadn't panicked out of worry for her brother. She had panicked because she had lost everything that should have been mine. But as it turned out, that was still not the most significant pain I would face. 6 months later, at the trial in Cook County, every truth was laid bare under the light of justice. Those 6 months of waiting were the longest of my life, each day filled only with silence and bitterness. Sarah and I had prepared the case carefully, from the bank statements to the full record of the life insurance and the trust fund that my mother had drained for years. Each page, each cold number, cut into the memories I had once called my mother's love. Then came a revelation that silenced the entire room. The $500 each month had all been transferred to someone named Hayden Clark, my mother's other child, whose existence I had never known in nearly 20 years. When that name was spoken aloud, I froze. I remembered clearly that when I was 15, while cleaning out my mother's closet, I had found the word Hayden written repeatedly in an old notebook. At the time, I thought it meant nothing, but now the missing piece fell into place with a pain so sharp it nearly stopped my breath. To end all debate, Sarah submitted the DNA test results, and that day, Hayden, 19 years old, entered the courtroom. He sat quietly, his face tense, but his eyes filled with resolve. Hayden agreed to appear, not to oppose my mother, but to hear her admit who he was, if only once in his life. When the DNA results were read aloud, confirming Hayden as the biological son of my mother Linda, the courtroom went silent. I sat motionless. My mother shook, tears streaming down her face, nearly collapsing at the witness stand. Then, in desperation, she burst out, shouting into the suffocating silence, "He is my son too. I only wanted him to have as much as Laura." But those words carried no weight anymore. Everyone in that room could see the truth. She had raised one child in the shadows by forcibly taking from the other. At last, the courtroom grew even more still as the judge spoke, his words cutting through like the closing of a decade of lies. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this court finds that Linda Miller has violated her fiduciary duty regarding her daughter's assets, Laura Miller. First, regarding the military life insurance payout, the entire sum of $400,000 was dispersed to Linda Miller at the time of Richard Miller's death, with the responsibility to use it for the benefit of Laura Miller. However, Linda Miller transferred the entire amount to a third party, and the money can no longer be recovered. This constitutes misuse of funds. Linda Miller can reimburse that amount, although enforcement will depend on her financial capacity. Second, regarding the trust fund of $500 per month, totaling nearly $66,000, bank statements show that Linda Miller continued withdrawing funds even after Laura reached adulthood and transferred them to another person. This constitutes unlawful appropriation. The court orders Linda Miller to repay Laura Miller in full. In addition, Linda Miller shall bear all legal costs arising from this case. The gavel striking the bench echoed like the final closing of a family's door. I sat in silence, my heart constricted. On paper, I had won justice. But in reality, the money my father left was already gone into my uncle's hands, and the years of hardship in my childhood could never be restored. When the trial ended, I stepped into the hallway with a heavy mind and a shattered heart. Near the door, Hayden was waiting, his eyes red, but his gaze steady and sincere. As I walked past him, he whispered just enough for me to hear, "I'm sorry for everything." I stopped for a brief moment, but I did not turn back. I did not know if I was angry at my mother, Hayden, or fate for pulling us all into this tragedy. I kept walking, leaving a heavy silence that no words could fill. And today, exactly 2 years since that fateful afternoon, it has also been 2 years of me struggling to heal the wounds in my heart. Since the trial, I have never returned to the rented house in the suburbs of Chicago. The last time I stepped inside was to pack my belongings and move permanently into a small apartment downtown. From that day on, I had no idea what had happened behind the doors of that old house, and I no longer cared to know. The money the court ordered my mother to repay still arrives in my account each month. All of it comes from Hayden. Maybe that is his way of trying to make up for the bitter truth I was forced to endure. As for the insurance money, the money that could have completely changed my childhood, it is gone forever. My Uncle Marvin, the man who took it all from my mother's hands, ended his own life after years of deceit, carrying with him promises of interest and repayment that were never fulfilled. Sarah, after the trial, she held me tightly in the courtroom. I broke down on her shoulder like a child. Maybe that was the first time I had felt so completely the weight of my loneliness. And from that day on, although Chicago and Milwaukee are hours apart, we still find ways to meet a few times each year. She has become one of the very few pillars left in my life. As for the woman who gave birth to me, I do not know, and I no longer want to know. To me, she left my heart the day the truth was revealed. If there is one thing I want to leave you with through this story, it is this: money can be lost, and money can be earned back. But trust, once broken, can never truly be healed. Cherish the people who love you and live for you, because sometimes the very ones you trust the most can be the ones who hurt you the deepest. And my story ends here. Over the past 2 years, I've stepped into a new life. Some people say I've been strong, while others say I've been too cruel. But what about you? What do you think? Was I right, or was I wrong to choose to face the truth? And have you ever wondered? Maybe my father died because he learned the truth about my mother? That was when the pain struck. The heart that had trusted her completely, even from far away, could no longer bear it and stopped beating. Share your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear from you. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to subscribe and like the video, so I'll be more motivated to share more stories with you. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the following story.